ado, I'm so privileged and honored to be here as the moderator for this panel. And our first panel is on the prohibition of pleasure, and we have three amazing speakers today. Larry Walters to my left, Diana Adams, and Carmen Vasquez. And so I'm going to read a little bit about each of them to bring us into their amazing backgrounds. And then each of them will have 20 minutes to present to you, and then we'll have about a half an hour of an open discussion with everyone. Okay? So Larry, or Lawrence G. Walters, Esquire, heads up Walters Law Group, which represents clients across the country in cases involving free speech and erotic expression. He presently serves as General Program Counsel for the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Alliance and is a member of our advisory council. He regularly comments in the national media on issues relating to censorship of erotic expression and has appeared on numerous television news programs, including Dateline, The View, 2020, The O'Reilly Factor, Dr. Phil, Good Morning America, The Today Show, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. So welcome.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to address you here again this year at National Sexual Freedom Day. I was one of the presenters at the inaugural session last year, and so I'm going to try to summarize and pick up where we left off and look back at where we've gone in the last year and kind of where we're going in terms of progress in the courts and in the legal field. I'm a First Amendment lawyer by trade, and so I get involved in issues of sexual expression and controversial speech for a living. And so what I can bring, I think, to the panel is some on-the-ground experience, letting the audience know where I see the flashpoints and what kind of battles we're fighting, what kind of successes we're having, what kind of failures we're seeing in the courts, and what needs to be done on a go-forward basis. While the First Amendment obviously protects sexual expression, when you're in court on an issue where you have an individual charged with obscenity for distributing DVDs of 5 guys banging his wife, it's not immediately evident to all judges that the First Amendment would provide a complete defense or even play a role in such a case, especially when the judge is from a small town, a self-professed, born-again, right-wing Christian, and has never seen that kind of thing in this part of town. Yet we deal with that all the time. And sometimes when we talk about sexual expression and the advancements that we make and some of the strides that we see on Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed this week, and Defense of Marriage Act, defense being dropped by the Obama administration. Some wonderful things are happening, but there's also some tremendous injustice going on throughout the United States, and real people suffering real consequences from sexual intolerance. The example I just gave is a case I'm dealing with right now involving a husband and wife, Teresa Taylor and Warren Taylor. She goes by Kimberly Cups. An obscenity charge brought by the Polk County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Grady Judd, who's famous for all kinds of intolerance and violations of the First Amendment, but he's arrested these 2 individuals, husband and wife, for distributing DVDs of just that, heterosexual activity, individuals engaging in sexual activity with his wife. Now, the fact that one or more of the male individuals happen to be of a different race than his wife may have played a role in Grady Judd's offense at this type of material. But we're in Polk County, Florida, and a jury of Polk County residents may have a problem with that kind of thing. And that kind of intolerance is still out there. And so those battles are being fought regularly throughout the United States. We have varying degrees of success. Fortunately, we have, in this particular case, this individual is well liked in the adult entertainment industry, was a featured dancer for many years, and she has a defense fund that's set up and is one of the most active defense funds that I've ever seen in representing clients for over 20 years in the adult industry. I look at cases involving extreme associates a few years ago, Rob Black and Max Hardcore, that was also prosecuted in Tampa, Florida. And those folks had virtually no support, no industry support, no defense fund support. Everybody was trying to distance themselves from, well, that's not the kind of content we make, he shouldn't have gone that far in creating that kind of material, and he's on his own, if they're going to go after him. But my content is sacred and should be protected by the First Amendment. We saw those kinds of divisions in the industry and a tremendous lack of support. Fortunately for Teresa Taylor, Ms. Cups, she has a very active defense fund and people supporting her. So we're hoping to beat back this particular sheriff. But this is the same guy within the last year, same sheriff, who arrested an individual for writing a book. For writing a book that was that the sheriff found somewhat offensive, and frankly, a lot of people found somewhat offensive. It was a book involving how to be a pedophile, how to love children. Now, this book had no pictures, no depictions of child pornography, no actual stories about child rape or engaging in sexual activity with children. But this was this individual's fantasies about how he felt about children, and was very offensive to a lot of people. Was it illegal? The Polk County Sheriff's Office believed it was. This was a prosecution, obscenity prosecution against an individual for writing a book. And this individual happened to live in Colorado and had sold every copy of his book. Amazon had yanked it off, and it made the national news a few weeks before this all happened. So, Sheriff Grady Judd decided that he'd stick his nose in this and see if he could, bring this guy into Polk County and prosecute him for obscenity violations. And so he did. He filed a charge against the guy, and Philip Greaves, gentleman's name, waived extradition from Colorado. His first and probably largest mistake, because I'm not convinced that the state of Colorado would have extradited him or allowed him to be extradited to the state of Florida for writing a book. But he waived his rights to challenge extradition, so they dragged him down to Polk County and prosecuted him for obscenity violations for writing a book. Over the course of time, he couldn't make bond. One of the conditions of bond was that he couldn't leave Polk County, Florida, if he posted bond. And he had no connections with Polk County, Florida. An undercover officer ordered the last copy of his book to Polk County, Florida. And so that's what the alleged connection was. But this is a guy who's sitting in jail for writing a book, can't get out of jail because if he's let out of jail, he can't leave Polk County. That's one of the pretrial restrictions. Well, he has no contacts with Polk County. He lives in Colorado. So where's he going to live? He didn't have enough money to stay in a hotel until his trial. Fortunately, I worked behind the scenes with the public defender and ultimately raised enough bond money and worked something out for him. But by that time, he had had enough of sitting in jail, and so he ended up taking a plea of guilty to an obscenity charge. And this book is now obscene in Florida. And he did months in jail and was convicted of obscenity for writing a book. Representing another individual out there who is basically being prosecuted for being an atheist. She wrote a letter to Sheriff Grady Judd. This is a little bit off topic from sexual expression, but it shows kind of the intolerance out there. She wrote a letter to the same Sheriff Grady Judd and signed it Esquire. She is a lawyer. She's a retired lawyer from Pennsylvania. She's not admitted to practice in Florida, but she wrote a letter asking about the sheriff's office donation of basketball hoops to the local churches from the prisons. They wanted the prisoners to take out all the basketball hoops and bring them to the churches and take them out of the prisons so the prisoners had nothing to do. And she felt that was favoritism of religion and asked about it and signed a letter, Esquire. They raided her house with 20 SWAT team agents, kicked in her door, searched her entire house, rifled through all her possessions, took her to jail on the felony charge of practicing law without a license.
What?
For signing a letter with the term Esquire, even though she's a retired attorney, because she wasn't licensed to practice law in the state of Florida. An outrageous charge. It gets a lot more outrageous from there. The story could go on forever. The next part of it I will mention to you because it's just crazy. A few months later, to ratchet up the heat on her a little bit, they arrested her for lewd and lascivious behavior in front of a child for moaning in her own house. saying, "Oh John, oh John," and supposedly a neighbor boy heard this occurring. Everybody admitted that there was no sexual activity occurring, and that it was merely a moan, and this was an arrest, a sexual offense for engaging in a lewd act in front of a child because a child overheard her moan in her own house. Again, another felony charge. So now they got her on 2 felony charges. We filed a lawsuit against the sheriff to try to back him off, and as soon as we filed the lawsuit, the prosecutors dropped all the charges against her, and now it's just a lawsuit against the sheriff. So, we're making some strides there, but this is the kind of stuff that happens in small town America. It isn't all Washington D.C. and it isn't all New York, and there are some real people feeling the heat out there in the United States on sexual expression issues and other sorts of intolerance. A lot of my practice recently has involved representing so-called service providers on the internet engaged in controversial speech or permitting controversial speech. Now let me explain what that is. Something like escorts.com, Craigslist, Backpage, providing a space for people to advertise escort services. Those folks are feeling a lot of heat. There have been a group of 40 attorneys general that have banded together and are putting pressure on all of these escort advertising websites to stop advertising, even though there's no law against it. No law is being broken. So these bullies have basically gotten together and said, we're going to come after you. We're going to take you down unless you clean up your act. And these escort sites are saying, what does that mean? Escort activity is legal. It's licensed in most jurisdictions. You have to get a license to engage in escort activity in most counties and cities. It wouldn't be licensing illegal activity. But these AGs are basically equating escort activity with the new euphemism of human trafficking. And human trafficking is now the word for all law enforcement whenever they want to refer to prostitution, and they lump in child sex trafficking with prostitution. And so they say that these escort sites are all engaged in human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and they all need to be shut down as a result. Now, engaging in escort activity is a far cry from exploiting a child. And those are 2 very different things. And actually, the online escort sites have a very close working relationship with law enforcement when it comes to problems with children being exploited. They want to work with law enforcement because if their site is populated with a bunch of people exploiting children, they're going to be taken down themselves and prosecuted for solicitation and child exploitation. So they have their own incentive to work with law enforcement, and they do. But now law enforcement has turned on them and has started blaming them for the problem. And so what's happening is you're driving all of the advertisement of this escort activity to underground venues. One thing that's happening is that a lot of them are just going to Russian or Ukrainian sites, put their ads up there, and they get the same ads out and they get the same customers. But now all of a sudden law enforcement doesn't have a door to knock on, and they don't have anybody to call if they have a subpoena. If a child is being exploited, they have nobody to go to and nobody to work with because somebody in Russia is going to say, you go get a court order from the Ukrainian court, and it's not going to happen. So there's these unintended consequences of this law enforcement action, of these AGs pounding their chest and saying, we're going after human trafficking and we're shutting down all these online escort sites. That's one thing that the escorts are doing. The other thing is they're going back to the traditional way of relying on a pimp and becoming drug addicted and driving the activity underground. The beautiful thing about online escort sites is it allowed people who chose that lifestyle to engage in escorting activity to take control of their life, to make decisions about their own life, to eliminate the middleman, to cut out anybody who was controlling their life, pimps and so forth. So this idea of some drug addicted prostitute relying on a middleman who's taking most of their wages is no longer reality. These escorts have taken control of their life. They post their own ads, they make their own money, they decide on their own customers. The internet is a beautiful thing. It also helps weed out bad customers and bad escorts by ratings and reviews. People can post a lot of anonymous information. This is a real escort, this is a cop. This is the person who's going to rip you off. This person isn't who she says she is. And all that stuff comes out now. And so everybody protects each other in that industry. and a lot of information that used to be shared only underground in certain channels is now readily available for the consuming public. Yet law enforcement wants to shut all that down and drive escort industry back into the Middle Ages. The other thing that we're involved in is a lot of sexting incidents. We talked a little bit about this last year. The idea of sexting, of people sending explicit images through their cell phones or through their cameras, is become pretty commonplace, and is actually fairly commonplace among teens. Yet teens are being prosecuted under child pornography laws if they do it. The same thing that adults can do, freely and do regularly, unless of course they're in a responsible position, such as Mr. Wiener, who can't do those things when he's a politician, or teachers, or firemen, or police. Those people aren't allowed to have sexual urges or inclinations, and then they're not allowed to engage in sexting activity. Otherwise, they'll be severely punished in the court of public opinion. The minors, of course, are sent to jail and required to register as sex offenders in most states. We're making some progress on that. I'm happy to say that as a result of constant haranguing and harassing and lobbying and writing, we have finally gotten the state of Florida to change its law on sexting. So what used to be a 5-year prison sentence and a sex offender registration offense is now a $25 civil fine for the minors. So there's some but these these sexual outlaws out there are really feeling the brunt of a lot of intolerance still. There have been there's some progress, some ups and some downs. The John Stagliano case is an obscenity case that here in Washington D.C. they tried to prosecute an adult entertainment producer for obscenity, one of the biggest obscenity cases in recent history, and they lost miserably. All of the charges were dismissed against Mr. Stagliano, and he walked out of court a free man after facing potentially the rest of his life in a federal prison for making movies. So that was a victory. That was nice to see. Like I said, we saw the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell recently. There have been a couple of cases involving violent content. Again, not directly related to sexual activity, but as soon as they get the camel nose under the tent with one of these issues, they try to use it as a basis for censoring other types of speech. So what we saw in the last year were two very important cases at the Supreme Court involving violence. One involving so-called animal cruelty videos, and a federal law that prohibited anybody from possessing a video depicting any activity involving an animal, cruelty to an animal, that was in violation of any law, whether the law was enforced where it was produced or where it was possessed. So basically you've got a situation where if you go down to Spain and film a bullfight and then bring the video back with you, you're in violation of this federal law. Or if you take a picture of somebody hunting out of season, I mean, the law was so ridiculously broad that it was fairly obviously unconstitutional, and the United States Supreme Court said, we already have laws prohibiting the behavior of being cruel to animals. Why do we need a law prohibiting depictions of the behavior? It's a violation of the First Amendment. There's a big difference between media depicting something and the activity itself. God bless, they finally figured it out. And that was written by Justice Scalia, one of the most conservative justices, and so it was an amazing decision. The fact that he happens to be a hunter may have played part of that. So that was one victory. The other was in connection with violent video games. The issue of whether or not states can prohibit individuals from, prohibit children from purchasing violent video games without parental consent has now been finally decided. Violence cannot be used as a basis to criminalize media, period. There's now been 2 cases in the last year that have found that, and the state of California took their law all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and in the Brown versus the Video Game Association, we have an established opinion now that violence cannot be used as a basis to criminalize media. So that's that was an important, again, win in the field of online of entertainment and attempts to censor entertainment. I guess in closing, I would mention again that under the Obama administration, the last couple of years, there have been some successes and some failures. The bottom line is that it's a mixed bag at this point. We see the victories and we celebrate them, but we also know that there are areas that need to be worked on, And by identifying those areas, we know where to put our efforts and our energies. And from my perspective, it's one case at a time and one issue at a time. And we'll hope for the best success next year. Thanks.